Thank you, Tim, for that very generous introduction. I was almost late getting here. We had kind of a family crisis. We've got a very beloved cousin, a lifetime Republican, who we found out was going to be voting for Kamala Harris. And the family was really very upset about it, primarily because none of us could imagine it would have happened if he were still alive. You didn't think the jokes would be good, did you, right? All right, so let's get on with the talk because I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. As we reach the end of this election cycle, the economy remains the most important issue for voters. That's because the economy over the past 3.5 years has been a disaster for working and middle-class Americans due to economic policies intended to accomplish progressive political goals rather than to generate economic growth. So on the question of which candidate you people believe would make the best economic policy decisions, who would make the best financial decisions for them, President Trump holds a 9 percentage point advantage over Vice President Harris, according to the latest Gallup poll. Now, no one should be surprised. Trump offers straightforward, pro-growth economic policies consistent with the plan he successfully implemented during his first term in office, as most voters hopefully fondly recall. He would keep taxes low, encouraging investment and consumer spending. He would reduce growth-hobbling business regulations and expand America's domestic energy production, reducing the cost of literally everything. Now, during his first term in office, this plan reduced unemployment to historic lows for every race and both sexes, increased wages and family incomes to historic highs, drove poverty to historic lows, reduced income inequality, and all without inflation. It's a plan that works, and Americans know it. In fact, CNBC does a poll every year, and going back to 2008, and the poll tellingly shows that over the past 16 years, Americans have been more pessimistic than optimistic about the economy in all but 2 years, 2018 and 2019, when Trump was in office. In other words, Americans were more pessimistic than optimistic about the economy in all 12 years that Presidents Obama and Biden occupied the White House, but were more optimistic than pessimistic in 2 of the 4 years that President Trump was president. Now, optimism, if you can see on this, it literally shot up when President Trump was elected, and nobody seriously doubts that his economic winning streak would have continued but for the pandemic. Today, if you look at the chart, economic pessimism is back to where it was in 2016 when President Obama left office, and about where it was at the end of 2021, which was the Harris-Biden first year in office. Well, why would that be? Well, the roots of this pessimism, this pre- and post-Trump pessimism, lie in 2 massive Biden-Harris spending bills, each of which passed only because Harris cast the tie-breaking vote: the misnamed American Rescue Plan and the almost comically named Inflation Reduction Act. It should have been the Inflation Acceleration Act. These bills led to an economy plagued by surging inflation that raised the price of everything over 20%, and Harris owns them. Real wages failed to keep up, lowering the standard of living for millions of Americans. This chart is based on Bureau of Labor Statistics data since early 2021, when Biden and Harris took office. It shows the growth in nominal wages in blue, that's the number on a person's paycheck, versus real wages, that is, what those nominal wages, what that number on a person's paycheck can actually buy. Now here a picture really is worth 1,000 words. Wages are way up, but workers can afford less, which any working class family could tell you without a graph. In case you're wondering whether real wages grew under President Trump, here's a chart that compares the Trump and Biden administrations. Real wages were up 6.3% under President Trump with minimal inflation, while they're down 2.4% under Biden with massive inflation. Add in that housing is far less affordable. The green line on this chart is the housing affordability. And this is due in great part to the interest rate hikes that the Fed implemented to reduce Biden-Harris inflation. And you have serious economic pessimism. By the way, note that the shaded area, I don't know if you can see the shaded area on here, that's the Biden administration. Now, while Democrats claim that the pandemic and supply chains were the major drivers of inflation that caused all of these problems, the reality is that they were only elements of that inflationary surge, elements good policies could have addressed. The real driver was incompetent economic policies. This didn't have to happen, and it certainly didn't have to happen to the extent that it did. Going back to January of 2021, when Biden and Harris took office, we knew people had a lot of money, right, from the pandemic payouts, all of which, by the way, were very bipartisan. And people were beginning to return to work. We knew that there was pent-up demand for goods because people had money and they wanted to spend that money because we'd all been constrained during the pandemic and restricted from what we could spend. So people had money, they were ready to spend, lots of demand, lots of money, and people increasingly confident about spending as they returned to work. What else did we know? Well, we also knew there was a shortage of goods for them to purchase because of supply chain issues. People had not been working, shipping was restrained, factories were shut down or were operating below capacity. So too much demand for too few goods. Now, before we had a Department of Education and before we had very powerful teachers' unions, even people in high school learned about supply and demand and the impact that would have on inflation. So ask yourself, with high demand and supply constrained, what is the one thing you wouldn't do? Well, obviously you wouldn't boost demand, right, before supply was there to meet it. Because when goods are in demand and supplies are insufficient to meet that demand, you get inflation. Too much demand, too few goods. It's inflation 101. So what did Biden and Harris do? Well, they passed that $1.9 trillion spending boondoggle in March of 2021, really 2 months into their presidency, ridiculously named the American Rescue Plan, putting even more, a lot more, $1.9 trillion more money in the hands of consumers and putting demand on steroids before supply was anywhere near where it needed to be to meet that demand. Now, even the economist Larry Summers, and some of you may have heard of Larry Summers. He's the former president of Harvard. He was President Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury, and he headed the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. So the Democrats' economist emeritus, this is their guy. And he warned in February of 2021, before they passed this $1.9 trillion spending boondoggle, that it would cause inflation, quote, we haven't seen in a generation. Well, of course, he was 100% correct. You can actually see inflation surge in March of 2021, the very month this bill passed. And it passed the Senate only because of Harris's tie-breaking vote as vice president. Now, Summers wasn't alone in predicting inflation. A number of Democrats, including Obama administration economists Jason Furman and Steve Ratner, warned against this spending boondoggle, as did a number of Republican economists, and as I did. Now, Biden and Harris now claim that inflation is down. Doesn't look like it's down, does it? They now claim inflation is down, but we know that inflation is actually increasing. It's only the rate at which inflation is increasing that's down. No, if inflation is up 3%, that means it's up 3%. That doesn't mean it's down. That means the rate at which it's increasing is down because they shot it up to 9%. This chart shows. It compares inflation under President Biden and under President Trump and demonstrates that inflation is like compound interest and grows even when it increases at a slower rate. And even at today's slower rate, CPI was at 2.4%, the Fed's target is 2%, and CPI is the Consumer Price Index, and that's not the Fed's preferred inflation measure. The Fed's preferred inflation measure is actually about 3.3%. But in any event, it's still above the Fed's the Fed's target rate, even though the Fed has now started to reduce interest rates. Coincidentally, we have an election coming up, and maybe that's not why they did it, but maybe it is why they did it. In any event, while inflation is increasing at a slower pace than its 9% peak in June of 2022, it's not because Biden-Harris policy slowed it. What slowed inflation was the Fed's most significant interest rate increases since the early 1980s, which created additional pain for already suffering middle and working class Americans. To this day, policy-wise, Biden and Harris continue to spend like drunken sailors, which is an insult to drunken sailors because at least drunken sailors spend their own money. They're spending our money. Our federal deficit for fiscal 2024, which ended September 30th, came in at an historic high of $1.8 trillion. That's 13% higher than even fiscal 2023. That's an 11% increase, even though there was an 11% increase in total revenue to nearly $5 trillion, which is an historic high. So 11% more revenue, and they still spent significantly more money than the country has ever spent before on the deficit side. This dismal record isn't something that Harris wants to run on, can you imagine? Even though she can't think of anything she would have done differently. But so much for the change candidate, right? She's promising an opportunity economy. That is kind of funny, really. I didn't mean it to be funny, but it is funny. She never actually explains why she's waiting to implement the facets of this opportunity economy. She is the vice president, and as we all know, the real president, or the actual president, is barely functioning. But even if she acted today, there's an obvious flaw in this plan. Her problem is that Americans can only find economic opportunity if there's economic growth, something her plans would only stifle. Take taxes. Harris would increase taxes on successful individuals and businesses. It's a policy that's very popular, if not a mainstay on the left, but raising taxes unequivocally discourages private sector investment and growth, demeaning economic opportunity. On the regulation side, look, she's a San Francisco liberal at heart. Harris has indicated no inclination to meaningfully reduce this massive growth-killing federal regulatory state. A study released last month found that Biden-Harris administration will have increased regulatory costs per household by almost $50,000 by the end of their current term in office. Nor is she likely to abandon her career-long opposition to domestic fossil fuel production. Now, I believe her when she says her values haven't changed despite supposedly reversing her position on fracking, at least in politically significant Pennsylvania, which, I don't know if you heard this, but like yesterday, one of her staff came out and said, no, she really does want to stop fracking. So it's a little hard to figure out exactly what her policies are, but I believe her when she says her values haven't changed, and those values would be to reduce fossil fuel production, which reduces domestic energy production, which of course increases the price of everything. So from where will her opportunity economy's growth come from? Well, in a desperate effort, really desperate, to come up with something that differs from the disastrous Biden policies, Harris has offered a confused mixture of unserious proposals. Even the far left, never Trump, Washington Post has criticized as political gimmicks. It's hard for me to emphasize just how far left and anti-Trump the Washington Post is if you're not paying attention to this. They are way to the left. But they criticized Harris's plans. And they had good reason, because Harris's plans, the things that she talks about, and you can listen after this talk, she will continue to propose things. Her plans are all political. None of them are actually economic. She's not trying to improve the economy. She's trying to win an election with any gimmick she can come up with. And her political team has come up with some doozies. For example, to combat inflation, Harris has proposed that government fix the price of goods purportedly to stop businesses from price gouging. But as the subheading to this slide, which was supposed to be up there, but the subheading didn't make it, the subheading was, "Price gouging is not causing inflation, period." In fact, there's been no actual price gouging, as the Biden-Harris administration's own Department of Labor data makes clear. This next chart is from an article an economist E.J. Antoni and I did a couple of weeks ago, although this is updated. This chart shows the consumer price index, which covers the prices consumers pay for goods, and the producer price index, which covers the prices retailers like grocery stores pay for the goods they sell. Now, both numbers are through September. And as you can see, since early 2021, prices paid by businesses as measured by the producer price index have risen about 20+%. They're right up at that 20% line. That's precisely the same amount as occurred in prices paid by consumers over this period as measured by the consumer price index. In other words, inflation has been impacting the entire supply chain from producers to consumers. Had producers or retailers, your grocery store, your gas station, been price gouging, that is increasing prices more than inflation justified, the rate of inflation for consumers would have exceeded that for producers. It didn't. In fact, if you look, for much of the last 3.5 years, producers were actually absorbing more inflation than consumers were. It's only been catching up recently. So either they were unable to keep up, they were unable to increase prices fast enough because the Biden-Harris inflation was increasing so dramatically, or they were actually trying to shield consumers from the impact of these price increases because they thought they'd lose business if they didn't do that. But either way, businesses clearly weren't price gouging or causing inflation. Biden and Harris were doing that all on their own. But in any event, let's leave that aside for a minute, the fact there was no price gouging. In any event, price fixing is just a bad economic policy. As stated in another Washington Post opinion piece, quote, "It's hard to exaggerate how bad this policy is because government price fixing would lead to shortages, black markets, hoarding, among other distortions seen previous times countries tried to limit price by fiat." Now that sounds pretty bad. That's because it's pretty bad. I do love this article's title. When your opponent calls you a communist, maybe you don't propose price controls. You think? Jason Furman, former deputy director of the National Economic Council under President Obama, told the Washington Post that, quote, "The good case scenario is price gouging is a message, not a reality. And the bad case scenario is that this is a real proposal. You'll end up with shortages, less supply, and ultimately risk higher prices and worse outcomes for consumers if you try to enforce this in a real way," which I don't know if they would or they wouldn't. As Furman admits, Harris's price fixing proposal is not a real economic proposal. It's a political proposal. Well, of course it is. She wants to make people who felt like they were going to the grocery store and prices too high feel like she's going to do something. But this isn't doing something. As even the Democrats admit, price controls are simply bad economics. Harris and her crack policy team, it's a political policy team, not an economic policy team, really never intended this to be good economic policy. It's purely political proposal designed to cast blame on American businesses for the surging inflation Biden-Harris economic policies and Harris's tie-breaking votes caused. Now, so given her pivotal role in passing these two inflation-driving behemoth bills, which anybody who looks at inflation and when these bills were passed can see the connection as clear as the difference between dark night and bright day, you'd think she might have learned her lesson on government spending and inflation. But apparently she is not. The Washington Post editorial board also panned another Harris populist gimmick, that's quote unquote, to give first-time home buyers $25,000 in down payment assistance. Why? Well, because it would make housing it wouldn't make housing more affordable, right? Rather, it would stimulate housing demand, quote, which risks putting upward pressure on prices, close quote from the Washington Post. Well, of course it does. But again, Harris's goal was not to actually make home purchases less expensive. It was to assuage voters frustrated that housing inflation and increased interest rates have made owning a home too expensive thanks to Biden-Harris economic policies. I'm actually tempted. I thought about this a lot when I was putting the speech together. I was actually tempted to discuss, but I'm not going to, her appeal to black men by offering them $20,000 in free money to open businesses selling marijuana. Now, seriously, you could incredibly make that up. I mean, it kind of makes you uncomfortable just to hear it, doesn't it? I mean, imagine if I had this conversation with J.D. Vance the other day. Imagine if President Trump and J.D. made such a proposal. It's so blatantly insulting, demeaning, and political that it pains me even to acknowledge that a major political party candidate would propose it. So that's all I'm going to say about it. But I do want to talk about her plan to tax unrealized capital gains. She actually wants to tax investment gains for the most successful individuals and businesses before the individuals and businesses who made those investments have any cash to show for their efforts. Now here I'm going to leave the Washington Post for a minute. I'm going to go to Harris campaign surrogate and liberal Silicon Valley Congressman Ro Khanna. Even he thinks this is a bad idea. On CNBC, he said, "I don't think a blanket tax on unrealized capital gains is a good idea." Well, you think? Let's say you're an entrepreneur. You create a company. It gets to 100 million or 200 million on paper, and after taxing that, you're probably going to force that person to sell it. They're probably going to sell it to private equity. Do you really want entrepreneurs to be forced to sell their companies to larger institutions and to decline in value? You're going to disincentivize investment in those startups. Well, of course you are. So is she serious? She's from San Francisco, right next to Silicon Valley. Is this a real economic proposal? Well, not according to campaign surrogate Mark Cuban. And I can't believe I actually had to put this guy's picture up. This guy is such a buffoon. I mean, he does prove that you can get rich and not be particularly bright. But also appearing on CNBC, Cuban stated, quote, "Every conversation I've had is that it's not going to happen," this tax on unrealized capital gains. He said that he frequently communicates with Harris's team and shared their explicit feedback. Quote, "Their verbatim word to me is, that's not where we want to go." Well, that's clearly where she wants to go. The problem is that it's an idiotic idea from an economic perspective, but perhaps not from a political perspective. Keep in mind, Cuban is out there defending Harris's economic agenda. That's his job, 24/7. And what's his best defense? It isn't going to happen. That's because there's no other defense. This is not a serious proposal. Even Cuban, who's no economic genius, knows that if it did happen, the markets would collapse. It's not a real economic policy, it's a political policy. So how about her tax policies in general? Well, Harris would increase taxes across the board, making the U.S. less economically competitive in a global market. This is a tax foundation chart that shows the impact of Harris's proposed tax policies versus the current law in the United States, and also the average for the 39-member Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It covers individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, and capital gain taxes. The dark blue line, the low line in every scenario, is current law, which was the law President Trump passed. The middle bar is Harris's proposed rate changes. That's the highest bar in each of the four scenarios. And the lightest bar is the average of the OECD's current rates. Under Harris, our competitive edge would disappear across the board, and the U.S. would be less competitive as a nation. Now, for example, Harris wants to raise U.S. corporate tax rate to 28%. Now, recall that President Trump lowered that to 21% because American companies were offshoring their businesses during Obama's administration, as you may recall. Obama had a 35% corporate tax rate. As a result of lowering the rate to 21%, in 2024 alone, corporate income taxes rose 26%, or $109 billion, under Trump's 21% tax rate. In the last 4 years, we've had the highest corporate tax collections in the history of the country at a lower tax rate. Art Laffer explains that very well with his curve. Harris raising that rate to 28% would result in a combined U.S. and state corporate tax rate of 32.2%, making it the highest in the developed world. Some states like California and New Jersey, the rate would be close to 40%. Now, no one can actually think that would be a positive for tax revenue over time, let alone for American jobs and prosperity. Harris would also allow the Trump tax cuts to expire next year, sacrificing all the benefits of those tax cuts, which, by the way, were substantial. According to a May 2024 statement from the House Budget Committee, it wasn't just corporate rates that benefited economic growth and generated increased revenue. Under Trump's tax policies in 2022, tax revenues reached a record high of nearly $5 trillion, and revenues averaged $205 billion above what the Congressional Budget Office predicted they would generate for the 4 years following implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In fact, thanks to the Trump tax cuts, federal tax revenue exceeded $4 trillion for the first time ever in 2021. That's the first year of the Biden-Harris administration. It's been at $4 trillion for every year since, and was close to $5 trillion in 2022 and 2024. So the Biden-Harris administration has benefited tremendously from 4 years with record high tax revenue, thanks to the Trump tax cuts. According to a 2021 Politico article, and those of you who are familiar with Politico would know that it's almost to the left of the Washington Post, their article stated, quote, "Though Democrats are hammering the rich for not paying their fair share in taxes, the increase is being driven by levies primarily paid by the well-to-do. For example, corporate tax receipts left 75%, the Congressional Budget Office says. At $370 billion, they easily top where they were immediately before Republicans slashed the corporate rate as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act." Now, so we've talked about corporate tax rates way up. How about individual income tax rates? Well, in 2017, the year before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so with higher tax rates, those Obama higher tax rates, personal income tax revenue was $1.6 trillion, and the top 1% of taxpayers paid 38.5% of that amount. In 2021, the most recent year for which we have this data, under the Trump tax cuts, income tax revenue was up to $2.2 trillion, and the top 1% paid 45.8% of that amount. So under the Trump tax cuts, we saw an increase in both income tax revenue and the percentage that was paid, of the percentage of that revenue paid by the top 1% of taxpayers, which clearly makes the Trump tax cuts the worst tax cuts for the rich in the history of tax cuts for the rich. They ended up paying more of a larger amount. Now, it's interesting, by the way, when you hear President Biden or Vice President Harris tout economic growth during their term in office, they never give any credit to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which has been in effect for their entire administration and has generated the highest level of tax revenue in U.S. history over a 4-year period. You know, we'll go figure. Trump wants to not only keep the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in place, he wants to cut taxes further, including a further reduction in our corporate tax rate to bring business and manufacturing back to the United States. That's a plan for economic growth, and also a plan to increase tax revenue. Now, we also know that Trump would cut growth-killing regulations, unlike Harris, as he did in his first term, his first term in office. This graph shows the increased regulatory costs under Biden, Harris, and Obama. Biden-Harris is the tall one, if you can't read this. The second highest is Obama, and the one where it's cut, well, obviously that's Trump. He reduced growth-killing regulations, and that's obviously, again, a plan to generate economic growth. Let's wrap this up with energy policy. Energy policy is a huge issue in this election because the price of oil and gas impacts the price of everything. In addition to driving our cars, heating and air conditioning our homes and offices, everything we purchase has to be delivered. And the higher the delivery cost, the higher the cost of the item delivered. Now, as you may have heard, the Harris campaign has touted, not a lot, but has touted the fact that oil and gas production in the U.S. is at record highs. And you may have noticed that she doesn't brag about that a whole lot. That's because it irritates her radical environmental base, but it's also true. However, it's important to keep in mind that oil production is high not because of Biden-Harris policies, but rather because the price per barrel of oil is also high, which is what makes increased production economically feasible for oil companies. But those higher per barrel prices also keep gas prices elevated at the pump. The Biden and Harris administration initially attempted to restrict oil production through expensive regulatory and licensing requirements. But those increased costs are impactful per barrel for oil when the price per barrel is low, right? Because if your costs are high and your revenue is low per barrel, then that makes a difference. When oil prices are high, then oil companies can afford those increased costs. So during the 2020 campaign, Biden and Harris unambiguously committed to end fossil fuels. Once they took office, because oil is priced on current supply as well as anticipated supply, prices rose, as anticipated reductions in American production also reduced anticipated supply worldwide. Oil is priced globally, not domestically. Thus, encouraged by our rushed and incompetent withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, and bolstered by these increased oil prices, in February of 22, Russia invaded Ukraine. Oil prices surged to over $100 a barrel, driving the price of gas at the pump, as I'm sure we all recall. The political implications for Biden and the Democrats of pain at the pump with $5 gas was obvious. So Biden drained our strategic energy reserves to try and get the supply up. You might notice that where that red arrow is, that's where Trump kind of drove the supply up when oil was cheap. But they drove it down to increase the supply of oil as the 2022 election was approaching. At the same time, oil companies were also able to increase production, notwithstanding the Biden-Harris regulatory cost. Why? Well, because the price of oil was high. It was high enough to offset those costs. That remains true today, with oil at about $70 a barrel. But the way to keep energy costs low for consumers and meaningfully impact inflation is to encourage oil production when the price per barrel is low. You do that by keeping the cost associated with production low and profitability high enough to encourage production even at lower prices. When the price per barrel goes down, if oil companies keep producing, there'll be more oil, and you'll notice that at the gas pump. Oils will increase production when prices are high on their own, because higher prices offset the regulatory costs. But increasing production at lower per barrel prices is what we need to lower consumer prices. Now, oil was about $52 a barrel on Trump's last day in office, and his production per day had jumped to 11 million barrels of oil. It was at 7.2 million barrels of oil per day when he took office. So that's about a 3.8 million barrel increase. That's up over 50%. Driving production at $52 per barrel required lower costs of production to encourage greater production, even at those lower per barrel prices. The impact for consumers is obvious. If you exclude the pandemic, gas at the pump averaged $2.67 under Trump. Under Biden, it averaged $3.61, or 35% higher than under Trump, even with his release of the strategic energy reserves. Even if you adjust for inflations, under Biden, prices were 21% higher. Lower per barrel prices mean lower prices at the pump. The trick is to increase production at lower prices, and that takes cost-reducing pro-fossil fuel policies. So when we say Trump's policies will encourage energy production and cause prices to decline, the price really of everything declined, the point is that we want production to remain high even as prices drop, because oil production will remain profitable at lower prices with reduced regulatory and licensing costs under Trump. That is not what will happen under Harris. Harris's career-long opposition to fossil fuels and actions as vice president obviously do not bode well for reduced oil regulatory or licensing costs. As such, production may remain high only so long as per barrel prices remain high enough to justify production, and consumers won't see the benefits. The point is that increased production only lowers costs if the price per barrel, for consumers, if the price per barrel is low, and you can only do that with pro-fossil fuel production policies. Trump has them, Biden and Harris do not. So the bottom line of all this is that Trump offers a proven pro-growth plan that will reinvigorate our economy, benefiting all Americans. Harris offers growth-diminishing policies and political gimmicks. Rather than economic opportunity for American families, her policies are about political opportunity for herself. If Americans have had enough economic misery over the past 3.5 years and are ready for a return to prosperity, Trump has a plan for that. Harris does not. Please remember that as you vote, particularly those of you from the great state of Georgia or nearby North Carolina, and encourage others to vote. Our republic and our free market economy depend on it. May God bless each of you. May God bless Hillsdale for the wonderful, wonderful work it performs for our country. And may God bless the United States of America, the last best hope of man on earth. Thank you. No, thank you. So do a quick sales pitch here because I am a capitalist. This is, it's not coming up, it's only showing me. There we go. That's a new book coming out in January, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. That's all the advertising I'll do. The rest is just thank you all for being here. And I'm going to answer questions. I was telling my wife, I said, they tell me that there's a bunch of economists coming to this dinner, and I'm not an economist. And she said, that's all right, you play one on TV. So
Thank you, Mr. Puzder. We now have time for Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone.
Thank you. I got it. Thank you so much for the talk.
I think he wants to hold it himself.
Yeah, is that all right? Yeah, thank
there you go.
And thanks for all the jobs you created earlier in your career. Two questions.
Thanks for mentioning it.
Hillsdale, I'm sure, teaches comparative advantage. Help us understand tariffs. Is it a good idea? Second question. Some of the people I talk to say that I'm crazy to vote the way I vote, given so many former cabinet members having a problem with the former president. Can you lend us some perspective on that topic as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the cabinet members I know think he's great. Gene Scalia would be back in a minute. Who could you ask for that was better than Gene? And Betsy DeVos, Department of Education. I mean, there are some who look. Trump is a CEO. He's not a politician. So what you're going to get is people that don't perform the way he wants them to will be let go. And since most of them are politicians, they take it. They're very sensitive about that. And if you're sensitive, you shouldn't join the Trump administration. This will not be a good place for you. I tell you, Kevin Hassett, Steve Moore, Art Laffer, Larry Kudlow, all good friends of mine, will be back. This is not, people will be back. They're going to exaggerate whatever they can. Tariffs, I almost thought about covering tariffs in the speech, but they told me I only had half an hour, so I'm glad you asked the question. Look, what you need to understand about tariffs is tariffs aren't just good and bad. I mean, tariffs are bad, tariffs are good. No, that's not true. There are some tariffs that are good and there are some that are bad. A good tariff is we don't want China supplying us with parts for our F-16 fighter bombers, right? I mean, that makes some sense, right? I think President Trump mentioned that at his New York Economic Club speech. We've got to restrict. We don't want them providing our masks, right? If people get sick, we want to have the masks here, not they hoard them in China. So there are certain things that we need to produce here. I would point out also that when President Biden and Vice President Harris took office, Trump had a number of very strong tariffs in place against China. They're all still in place. I mean, Biden could have eliminated the tariffs just like Trump instituted them. Not only are they in place, but 1 week after the debate between Harris and President Trump, they increased all the tariffs. They increased electric vehicles, 100% tariff. Solar batteries, 50%. I'm not going to remember all the other things. There were, essential metals, aluminum, steel, cranes, masks, all went to 25% tariffs. And then they initiated another group of tariffs that will take place over the next 2 years, including tariffs on semiconductors. So you can't say tariffs are bad, because some tariffs are good, all right? So you need to keep that in mind. Number two, some tariffs are just unfair. Now, after World War II, we were the only country whose industrial base and agricultural base weren't blown to smithereens. So we, very wisely, for our economy and for other countries' economies, we enacted things like the Marshall Plan. We rebuilt Japan. We were very generous to other countries, and we allowed them to impose tariffs while we kept our tariffs very low. But today, does it make sense that you can sell a Mercedes-Benz sedan in Detroit and pay a 2% tariff, and if you want to sell a Ford or a Chevy sedan, which they don't make anymore because they had to pay these tariffs, you had to pay a 10% tariff to sell them in Berlin? You know, that's not only not fair, but we've really destroyed the sedan part of the business in the United States. Ford doesn't make any because they can't make them profitably anymore. They can't compete. So trade should be fair. Nobody objects to fair trade. What they object to is unfair trade. Now, people will say, well, is Trump's going to impose these 200% tariffs? Look, if Donald Trump is talking, he's negotiating. And if you listen to everything he says with that in your mind, you will understand what he's talking about a lot more than if you try and understand it through what you hear in the legacy media. I refuse to call them mainstream, but the legacy media. And he has positioned himself better to negotiate good trade deals with other countries than any president in the history of the country, including him in his first term. I mean, he's positioned to move forward effectively. So there are good things. Tariffs do keep, low tariffs do keep prices down. You keep yours down, we'll keep ours down. I think that's fair. You raise yours real high, and you come in and you try and destroy our domestic businesses. Look at the garment industry. Garment industry's gone, right? It's gone. It used to be huge. St. Louis had a huge district that was just garments. It wasn't just New York. That's all closed. That's because labor unions drove prices, wages too high, and China sucked all the business out of the United States. And they did it in part by not only inexpensive labor, but by government subsidies. They subsidized their businesses to try and hurt our businesses. Well, if the government's subsidizing their business to try and hurt our business so they can put our businesses out of business and then do whatever they want with prices because they now don't have any competition in the United States, that's something we need to prevent. So not all tariffs are good, not all tariffs are bad, but there are certainly good justifications for various tariffs. That was a longer answer than, that's why I didn't include it in the speech, right? All right. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
When Trump wins the second term, will he need to pass a new tax bill, or can he just keep the old one?
No, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires. Now, interestingly,
and what about SALT? Why is he promising SALT to come back?
Well, that I don't know. I don't have to agree with President Trump on everything. and the SALT deduction is one of those things I don't agree with. I think the SALT deduction, I don't think it's fair. I live in Tennessee. We don't have a state income tax. If I make, I don't know, $100, and a guy in New York makes $100, I don't know why I should be paying more for our national defense than that guy does, because his state wants to tax him so they can put in a bunch of things that state thinks are good for the state. I mean, I don't think there should be assault deduction. But President Trump feels differently, and we'll see what happens with it. He will have to pass a different bill. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will expire. Hopefully we can make those tax cuts permanent. Certainly, if we get control of the House and the Senate, they'll be made permanent and probably improved. Interestingly, the corporate tax rate is not part of that. The corporate tax rate at 21% will stay in effect unless repealed.
I'm over here.
There you are.
Hey. I am one of the economists in the group here, and I did my PhD at the University of Chicago in the 70s.
All right.
So you can imagine who all my teachers were. I was very blessed.
Was Art there then?
Yes, he's a friend of mine, and I
good
was
guy.
on the commission to redo the tax code in Georgia, and he helped me every day. He was just great. I'm going to ask you a question, the kind of question I hate being asked, which is to say, if Kamala Harris wins, what should I do with my retirement money, my home, and my 2 real estate investment properties?
Gosh, I wonder the same thing. I don't know. Look, we've got, as you know, we have incredibly serious problems in this country at the moment. Our debt is out of control. We're talking $35 trillion. This is, our GDP is what, about $26 trillion? This is absurd. That deficit, $1.8 trillion in deficit spending, you have to be insane to spend that amount of money. And you know how much of it, there's a huge percentage of that is interest. About half of what you pay in income taxes just goes to pay interest on our debt. If you look at debt, it looks like, if you look at interest rates, it looks like that our interest payments on our debt, it looks like that inflation charge goes like this. We've got very, very serious problems. She has no solution for any of these problems. You can say, well, one solution is you grow your way out of it. That's probably University of Chicago thought. You're going to grow your way out of this problem. Another way is that you've got to cut spending. We do have, revenue was up 11% last year to a record high. Tax revenue is a record high. Well, it means you have a spending problem. It doesn't mean you have a revenue problem. So we've got to do things to reduce our expenses, and there are things that we can do. Just she's not going to do any of them. She's going to kick the ball down the field and hope she can get through 4 years or 8 years without having to do anything that would alienate voters, because that's the way they think. Retaining power trumps anything, economic policy, foreign policy, political policy, it doesn't matter. They want to retain power, and that's what her policies are about. So I don't know what you should do. I'd say be careful. I wouldn't have any debt. If you have debt, get rid of it. Pay it off, sell what you have debt on, and pay off the debt. That scares me going forward here. So that'd be my best advice at the moment. I bought gold a few years ago, and I got to tell you, I'm pretty happy right now. There are gold ETFs, as you know, Spider Gold, and I can't remember the name of the other one. I also bought water rights. I think that's a good investment, but I'm not an investment advisor, and I don't purport to be. But personally, I bought water rights and some gold as a hedge against a collapse of the economy. Do what you can. Pray. Pray that he wins. Anybody else? I saw one other hand. There's a couple more.
My question is, the Fed fund rate is about 5%, and the prime is 8%. From your perspective, what should it be and how to make that happen so that the economy will just boom?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is get inflation under control, and I don't think it's under control. And I hate to say that, because you may recall, the Fed is probably going to increase interest rates if Trump's elected. Why do I say that? Well, because during the Obama administration, Janet Yellen raised interest rates one time in January of 2016. The market reacted adversely. It was an election year. She backed off and never increased them again. When Trump was elected, the Fed, under Yellen for a number of quarters, and then under Powell, raised it 8 consecutive quarters. They raised interest rates. There was no inflation. Economic growth was fine, and they raised interest rates for 8 consecutive quarters. So if Trump's elected, they may raise it again to actually try and get inflation under control. I can't give you numbers. As I said, I'm not an economist, but I think I don't think that they should be loosening the reins just yet. But I think we're close to when they could loosen the reins, and I think you may find in the first couple of months under President Trump that you're going to see a reversal of a lot of the economic issues that we're having currently, because as economists in this room, I'm sure know, how people feel about the economy is as big a factor in economic growth as what's actually happening in the economy. And the better people feel about it, the better businesses feel, the better consumers feel, the more economic growth you get. So we'll have to wait and see. But I don't have a good answer. There's probably other economists in here who would be able to give you a number. I can't.
Andy, God bless you, and God bless Hillsdale College.
I agree.
You make me feel somewhat optimistic. I do have a fear. Trump takes office, God willing. We're going to send 98% of the people in Congress back. We spent 2 years with a Republican Congress with a very strategic benefit in terms of the margin they had. We didn't cut a single penny. We didn't deprive any single department in the federal government of a penny, and we increased spending in line with the Biden administration. It drives me crazy. Tell me what I should feel good about.
You should feel good that it's Trump's second term. Because in his first term, he was going to have to run for a second term. And while we were dealing, the reality is that with the deficits approaching $1 trillion, that was bad, but it wasn't like suicidal yet. You could live with that for a while. We did have a strong economy. We could live with that level of debt, particularly given how much of it is domestically held. We're done with that. And he knows it. And in a second term, he's not running for a third term. The important thing with respect to getting things done in his second term is going to be two things. One is, what's the margin of victory in the Electoral College? If it's narrow, he's got less power. If it's vast, he's got stronger power. And the popular vote. If Trump wins the popular vote, be the first Republican to do so since 2004, and has a strong showing in the Electoral College, he's going to have a lot of power to get things done, at least for the first year to 18 months. And unlike the first term, people are preparing for that, to get things done. Because the first time, nobody thought he was going to win. And so we were not as prepared as we should have been. This time, we're going to be prepared.
How do we avoid a lame duck?
Hold on.
Hello. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Over here, on your right,
There you go.
far right.
There you are.
Thank you. Professor Tim Barnett from Jacksonville State University. If you could make 3 suggestions to a prospective Trump administration, what would those 3 suggestions be?
To reinforce the policies that you had the first time. We're talking about economics. We should be doing things on the world stage. We should be doing things on the border. We should be doing things about crime. But if you're talking about economics, get a tax bill passed. Get everybody in the cabinet and a staff of people headed hopefully by Elon Musk to reduce the regulatory burden in this country. And to get rid of all those ridiculous licensing fees and regulatory costs that the Biden administration imposed on the fossil fuel industry, and let those guys know they should be drilling and producing to the maximum of their potential. So I think if we do those 3 things, we're going to be in pretty good shape.
Hello. My name is Rick Ardito. I'm over here on your left, back here.
Oh, there you go.
I'm a
This light's really
CPA
strong.
in California. You talked about the SALT deduction, and I know, right? I'm sorry. And it seems to me like, based on your commentary, that you'd like to eliminate it altogether. But I actually asked Steve Moore this question back in 2020. It seemed inadvertently built into the TCJA that there's a marriage penalty in the SALT deduction, capping it at $10,000, whether or not you're single or married filing jointly. So I guess my question is 2-part. Do you want to eliminate it completely? And I don't know if Trump agrees with that, obviously, but if you were advising him again, could we maybe look at not building in the marriage penalty to that?
Yeah, there shouldn't be any
specific
marriage
deduction?
penalty. I wasn't aware that there was, but there shouldn't be, and $10,000 doesn't bother me at all. I think people at the lower end of the economic scale have been so damaged over the past 4 years through the pandemic and then through the Biden-Harris administration that anything we can do to help them, I think we should do. Matter of fact, I don't want to get too far out of a limb on this, but I don't mind rewarding people that work smart, so there's no tax on tips. I don't mind rewarding people that work hard, so there's no tax on overtime. And I don't mind rewarding people that worked hard all their life, so there's no tax on Social Security. As long as we can justify it with economic growth that makes up the revenue loss from those policies, and I think President Trump thinks we can. But no, I wouldn't have a problem with that, and I'm sure Steve will have a voice. He'll probably remember your question and have some comment on that as well.
We now have time for one more question.
Given that the next recession is close, isn't it perhaps in the long haul bad for the Republicans if we win this fall?
Given that the what is closed?
The next recession, it's unavoidable. We've been 15 years rising with one harakiri in 2020. How are the Republicans going to bounce back, given that in the next 4 years we'll have a recession?
If it happens in the first year, I think we're fine. If it happens in the third year, we're going to get blamed for it. They blame us anyway. Could happen during the middle of the Obama administration. Could happen in the middle of the Biden-Harris administration. They still blame us. But if it happens in the first year, I don't think they can credibly blame us, and I think we can work our way out of it. So I do think we need to win. We need to win for the good of the country, even if there's a recession that damages our reputation as a party. As Larry Elder likes to say, we have a country to save, and we do. This is bad, folks. I mean, it's bad on the world scene. It's bad at the border. It's bad in our cities. The economy is on the brink of potential real bad results, and we need somebody in there who knows what he's doing and has the strength and the ability to get it done. So we all need to vote, and we need to vote soon, and we need to vote. If I were a Democrat, I'd say we need to vote often. Anyway, everybody have a wonderful night. Thank you so much.